Hey there! Today I'm checking out the i3-2120, which is a 2-core, 4-thread, 3.3 GHz CPU from the year 2011. This is a budget CPU, and it's meant for light gaming. The MSRP of this CPU is only $7,316. Very budget. I think Google is messing up there. It's definitely not meant to be that much. And today I'm going to be throwing literally every single game I have at it, besides the insanely simple ones like Brawlhalla or Microsoft Solitaire, because those will run on literally anything. Let's get right into it. Okay, just real quick, right after recording that clip, I realized something. So I've been editing this video on the i3-2120, and one of the cores momentarily died. Yeah! CPU was at 100%, but it was showing 75% usage in hardware monitor and also in task manager, and one of the cores just wasn't doing anything. Restarting the computer fixed it. I just never seen that happen before. Also, we're pairing this with a RTX 3060 and a 16GB dual-channel 1600MHz DDR3. GTA 5 at 720p on the normal or low settings. I mean, normal is low, so it is what it is. But it ran at around 57 frames per second, which, to be honest, is slightly less than I was expecting. But it's also no means a bad gameplay. It did a great job, I'd say, and it was perfectly playable and not bad. But what about higher settings? Because we have an RTX 3060 to our disposal. 1080p was getting exactly the same FPS, or at least it seemed. I could have been within the margin of error, but yeah, it seemed exactly the same. And 1440p on the normal settings was as well basically exactly the same, which I'm not that surprised, but usually when the resolution goes up, it's a little bit more CPU intensive. But I guess in this case it's about the same because the frame rate stayed the same, so that's something. Then I tried 1080p on the very high settings. I had, if I remember correctly, 1 or 2 settings not fully maxed out, but the rest of them were. I think it was grass intensity or grass quality. Either way, it ran decently. I guess if you limited the frame rate to around 40, it would be fine. But it was stuttering like crazy with the maximum settings, which I guess something in there must be CPU intensive, but it was running. But I actually play on the normal settings in this case, because on the normal settings it gets a lot better FPS, and I can't really tell that much of a difference. Besides, the grass is slightly less good, but if I'm not mistaken, that's not CPU intensive, so you can just turn the grass up and everything else stays on normal, and the game will look nice, and it should perform, I don't want to say great, but it'll perform good. Borderlands 3 at 1080p on the low preset, or the lowest preset, was getting around 50 frames per second. And that is actually not very good. Yes, it was getting 50, but it was also stuttering like crazy every few seconds. Like, to a point where the game just locks up and starts going again, which is definitely not good. I also have noticed that my dual-core 4-thread Pentium G7400 does the same, just not quite to this extent. I don't know how much a i7-3770K, for example, would play the game though, because it has more threads and cores, by double. So it might do quite a bit better, I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely not ideal, especially when you're in a gunfight this game. Then I went over and set the settings pretty much to the highest. I just disabled some CPU intensive settings, which is the following: texture streaming, material quality, shadows, draw distance, terrain detail, foliage, and fog. Those ones tend to use more CPU, at least it was on my testing on my Core 2 Quad, so I set those off, and the rest of the settings are on the highest. And it ran about the same, just still stuttery. I also tried limiting the frame rate to 40, and it still didn't do anything. It was still stuttering, but it was a slight bit smoother, but yeah, it still wasn't a great experience, especially when I was being shot at in 78 different directions when I randomly walked into the wrong place. The next game upon the list is a BioShock Infinity! and the game was getting between 70 and 100 frames per second at 1080p on the Ultra preset, which I gotta say, that's more than I was expecting, especially because Borderlands was so stuttery. This basically wasn't stuttery at all, and I'm pretty impressed. And then I had to try 1440p, and I'm pretty impressed in that as well. It ran actually quite nice. Exactly the same. So that's nice. Fall Guys at 1080p on the low settings was getting around 90 frames per second with stutters here and there. And then I tried the highest settings and it ran pretty much exactly the same. So Fall Guys is basically pretty much playable. For the best experience, I'd probably just lock the frame rate to 60 and that should get rid of most of the stutters, or at least try to iron out most of them. You'll still have some, but it was a nice experience. Fortnite, Stutter Night on 1080p on performance mode on the low settings was getting around 80 frames per second, which is actually quite nice, and it's nice and playable too. It's totally unplayable because that's exactly why I didn't win this round. Yeah, it's totally the FPS fault that I fell off the cliff and died. Yep, I totally am amazing at this game. Then I tried the same settings, 1080p, with a 50 frame per second cap. And it helped a little bit with the stutters, but they're still there. I don't know if I'd recommend having a cap or not on this, but, you know, it still is a nice experience. It's just stuttery because it's Fortnite. Or maybe it's more stuttery on this than quad core. I don't know, to be fair. Maybe? I'm gonna have to test out someday. Rocket League 1440p on the highest settings was getting around 140 to 150 frames per second the entire time, which I'm actually very surprised about because the HD 5450 struggled to play the game. And I forgot what frame rate it was, it just wasn't good. So, yeah, this is pretty impressive. Supraland on the highest settings at 1080p was getting around 55 frames per second, which is actually less than I was expecting, and it was also a bit stuttery, but limiting the frame rate to around 50 basically fixed most of the stuttering, and it was a pretty playable experience. I'm surprised it actually performs this bad. I was expecting it to get around 100 frames per second, so yeah, I'm quite far off here. Since recording the last clip, I went over and had a little bit of pizza, okay? I know this is weird, but I took a break, got some pizza, and I was eating it with a fork. Okay, first of all, 98 people in the comments are now going to be yelling at me for eating pizza with a fork. But there's also something else. I bit the fork, and now there's a piece of my tooth missing that you probably can't see. So now I'm toothless John. That's neat. There's like a big rough spot on it. That's glorious. But Valorant at 1080p, or 1440p. MSI Afterburner overlay was only showing 1080p, like this, how big it is. It looks like 1080p, but in the game it's 1440p. I don't know what it is. It was on the high settings, and it was getting a stuttery 60 frames per second, so not ideal, especially for Valorant, but it was somewhat playable. After that, I got banned from Valorant, so that's a good sign. Momentarily, it was a 5-minute ban it seemed, but still though, that's a good sign. I keep getting banned from this game. It's a whole thing. Then I lowered the settings from high to low, and I'm still not sure if it's 1080p or 1440p. I'm assuming it's 1440p, but even if it was 1080p, it would probably be the same performance on 1440p. But either way, it was getting a nice, playable 80 plus frames per second. Not 144 frames per second high refresh rate experience, but hey, it is a quite nice experience nonetheless. Halo Infinity on 1080p, the lowest possible settings, ran at a glorious, at least in the menu, 20 to 30 frames per second. When I try to load into a multiplayer game, what happens, you might be wondering? Well, nothing. It gives you an error. Yeah. I also thought maybe it might be because the CPU was at 100% constantly when loading in a map, so maybe the limiting the frame rate might help. I found that helped with my Core 2 quad. Granted, it still wasn't able to play the game, but it did help load into a map. And it didn't do anything here. I even limited it to 1 frame per second so it could focus on loading the map even more, but no. It didn't do anything. It just gave you an error saying multiplayer was unavailable. So that's sad. Ark Survival Evolved on the highest settings at 1080p. It was getting around 65 frames per second. Though the thing is, it was actually graphics card bottlenecked here, so I had to actually overclock the graphics card to see the full potential of the CPU here. Overclocked, the game was getting around 70 to 80 frames per second, so not bad. I should also mention, when I had the card overclocked, it was also playing the game on medium settings and not the epic settings, because it was still bottlenecking the CPU with the graphics card. Right? Is that... no, the graphics card was 100%. I can't work out how to speak apparently though. Apex Legends at 1080p on the lowest settings with a 30 FPS minimum target. The game was getting around 50 to 55 frames per second, which is fine. Really, phone? You have to do this ping right now. The game was getting around 50 to 55 frames per second, but it was a little bit stuttery, so when I go over and limit the game to 45 frames per second, because the dips were going down into the mid-40s, with a 45 frame per second limit, the game was pretty much buttery smooth. Occasionally it might dip down to 40 in some intense areas, but to be completely fair, it is a nice experience. Just maybe not the best competitive experience. Team Fortress 2 was getting around 80 frames per second on 1080p on the highest settings, which is pretty impressive, I'd say. Not sure about 1440p or how it would be if I limited the frame rate, because it was occasionally stuttering here and there, so maybe limiting the frame rate might have helped. One way or another, it was a nice experience and totally playable. CSGO at 1080p on the highest settings was getting around 80 frames per second, and it was horrible because I couldn't stay alive, so 80 is not enough. That's how that works, right? It's totally not skill related. Yeah. Okay, to be real though, it is a nice experience, perfectly playable, and yeah, I can't complain at all about it, besides the fact that everybody in the game is better than me. That's fine. BeamNG drive at 1080p on the absolute highest settings in the game, including dynamic reflections, with the update rate turned on to #1 because that's very CPU intensive. Either way, it was getting 50 frames per second on my test loop, basically going around the entire West Coast USA map, which I gotta say is pretty impressive, especially compared to my Core 2 quad. Though the thing is, the dynamic reflections in general are pretty intensive, so when I disable the dynamic reflections, the frame rate goes up by a little bit. You don't really notice much of a difference in the game, which is quite nice. And if you wanted even more frame rate, you could of course go over and turn down the mesh quality. That's actually quite CPU intensive, but I find leaving the mesh quality and all the other settings on the highest and just turning dynamic reflections off is the best experience. Yes, it's not 60 frames per second plus all the time, but it's a good experience. I don't know what else I could say about it besides that. Also, I should add, I do have the frame rate capped to 45 frames per second on the highest settings. The reason why is because on the bigger maps like West Coast USA, you have some very nice performing areas where you're going to be getting around 70 frames per second, and some not so nice performing areas where you're going to be getting around 50 to 45 frames per second. So it's quite noticeable when you drop and raise the frame rate, so I just limited it to 45, which it will pretty much always get, and it's a very smooth experience. Roblox Arsenal at the lowest Roblox Arsenal settings and the lowest Roblox settings. Well, the second lowest, because I have it set one above the lowest, which just basically makes it so you can see a little bit further. Either way, the game wasn't exactly running the best. It was getting around 50 to 60 frames per second with stutters. The problem there is it is a FPS shooter, meaning you need to be able to shoot another player before they get you. It's hard to do that when your game is freezing at times. But basically, besides that though, if you limited the frame rate, it probably would be fine, but it's not ideal. Minecraft Java with 8 chunks render distance, with the medium settings, with the complementary shaders. On the highest complementary shader settings, almost the highest, the game was getting around 40 to 45 frames per second, which is not ideal, and it was dipping into the 30s at times. But it was playable with shaders, more playable than the Core 2 Quad, but still not 107% ideal. And without shaders, the game was getting about 100 frames per second, which is a lot better. I should also add, I am using the Iris mod and the Sodium mod. The Iris and Sodium mod are not the best for weaker CPUs, although they do give you the more frame rate. They also lag more when loading in chunks, so it's a trade-off. Minecraft Bedrock Edition on the highest settings, with a 16 chunk render distance and anti-aliasing turned all the way down to the minimum. It was getting around 90 to 100 frames per second, and it was a little bit less stuttery than Minecraft Java, which is quite nice. I should also add, I do have a main channel. This is actually the second channel of mine. I have 2 channels. The main one's locked out too, by the way, if you're wondering. Either way, on the main channel, I did do a live stream where I streamed Minecraft, basically, on those settings, while importing this video that you're watching right now, which took over 10 hours to import because it's so much footage. Either way, doing all of that, I was able to still live stream with OBS. Granted, I was using NVIDIA to encode the video, and it worked not flawlessly, but it worked fine, and it got by, you know? I was able to complete the live stream with nearly no issues. I just had a problem with loading stuff. And I also accidentally powered off the computer during the stream. But that was not the computer's fault, that's my fault because I hit the power button twice. Yes, I cut the power twice during the stream. The first time was when I bumped it and the computer was shutting down. I was able to cancel the shutdown and I was fine. And then the second time I had my foot on the power button and I didn't realize it. It was on the power button for over 5 seconds and then it hard powered off the computer. So that was fun. But I am actually pretty impressed in the CPU. Yes, it isn't the best, but it's also not meant to be the best. It's an i3. It's not an i5. It's not an i7. It's not an i7K series either. It's meant to be a budget CPU that can do some gaming. And if you bought it in 2011, it can still do budget gaming 11 years later in 2022, almost 2023 in 4 months from now. So, I am actually really happy with the CPU. You can get it for $6 on eBay, I got mine for free, but $6 on eBay, if you get like a Dell Optiplex for free, or like $5 and get it without the CPU, you can slap this in it for like $5 and get a Quadro 600 or something. You have a decent little cheap gaming computer for less than $30. That is not bad. But getting those parts like an Optiplex for $5, I don't know how you can get them for that cheap, but if you can, that's nice. Maybe offer up, I don't know. Another thing I should mention is video editing. Video editing is working on here, though at times it is not 100% ideal. As you see, the CPU is basically maxed out with 2 video tracks, which isn't all that much, but both of them are 1080p, so 2 1080p videos does max it out. Though that's also not exactly bad either, because it is getting the job done. Also, I have a Minecraft Bedrock Edition server. It's a server that I made for the main channel first, but if you want to join it, feel free to. It's open for anybody. It's anarchy, so if you want to join, feel free to. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.